There's a story making the rounds from an insider, a former advisor on Taiwan's ambitious new submarine project. It paints a picture that's less about national pride and more like a dark, bureaucratic comedy. Imagine the scene. Inside the control room of this brand new vessel, the Haikun, the command is given. But the high-tech integration system, bought from the UK, reportedly just flashes red.
Flashes red, not exactly what you want to see.
Not at all. And the torpedo tubes, which are said to have come from South Korea, apparently do nothing. They just sit there, silent.
Torpedo tubes. That's chill.
Yeah. The advisor didn't just call it a glitch. He warned that if they try to force this thing to dive, it could cost lives.
Yeah.
This single terrifying image, a silent torpedo tube that won't respond, cuts right through all the official ceremonies and press releases. Today, while Taiwan's defense minister was busy in a closed-door meeting, carefully admitting to great challenges in meeting the November delivery date, this insider's account suggests the problem isn't just a simple delay. It points to something far more fundamental. Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to understand what happens when a nation attempts the Everest of defense industries, building a modern stealth submarine under intense geopolitical isolation.
Right. It's an incredibly ambitious goal.
We are going to unpack the specific painful failures of the Haikun project, examining if the roadblocks are, poor engineering, fractured leadership, or maybe an inescapable result of overwhelming international political pressure.
It is fundamentally a case study in what happens when technology meets intractable geopolitics. I mean, when Defense Minister Wellington Koo spoke of great challenges, he was basically confirming this project is now front and center for Taiwan's defense self-sufficiency hopes.
Its success or failure really matters then.
Hugely. It reflects the power of Beijing's diplomatic campaign to isolate the island. We are watching technological ambition crash into reality, and we need to understand the wreckage, what it means.
Okay, let's start with the engineering challenge itself. Taiwan is attempting something extremely complex, building a modern stealth vessel. But unlike, say, the US, France, or Russia, they can't just go to a single friendly defense contractor and buy a complete package, can they?
No, absolutely not. That's the crux of the matter. The island's diplomatic isolation forces a completely unique and frankly crippling assembly process.
How so?
Well, Taiwan simply cannot buy an integrated submarine system off the shelf. Beijing leverages its diplomatic and economic might to enforce what's effectively an arms embargo, especially for something this sensitive. So the engineers had to become global shoppers, essentially.
Global shoppers for submarine parts.
Pretty much. Acquiring individual systems from a variety of sources, often under intense secrecy. The source material highlights that major components, everything from the sonar arrays, active and passive, the specialized periscopes, and the core combat systems, came from multiple international vendors: the US, the UK, Japan, and several distinct European partners.
Wow. So this isn't just about mixing and matching components. It's trying to get systems built to completely different national standards, different design philosophies, to operate seamlessly together. In a submarine, no less.
Exactly. It's what one official reportedly called a United Nations of systems. And judging by the setbacks, they definitely didn't have a universal translator. Or maybe not a good enough one.
And that logistical nightmare is now translating directly into technical failure.
Right. It seems so. The official setback is now confirmed. The November delivery target is quite challenging, as the minister put it. We know the vessel has already been forced to spend weeks in dry dock after the third critical sea trial back in July.
Weeks in dry dock after a third sea trial. That sounds serious. That's pretty deep into the testing phase.
It is. It suggests issues that cropped up well into testing, which is often a much bigger problem than something found during an early shakedown.
So what are analysts pointing to? What are the most severe technical problems right now? Because we're clearly not talking about, minor leaks or a dodgy pump here. The scale of delay suggests something pretty fundamental is wrong.
Well, the focus is largely on the propulsion and cooling systems. There is strong speculation that the issues stem from suspected leaks in the main engine's cooling system.
Okay, a coolant leak. Serious on any ship, I guess, but on a sub.
Potentially catastrophic. If the cooling system is compromised, you get excessive heat, maybe system shutdowns. But crucially, if that leak points to a failure in the alignment between the propulsion unit and the pressure hull itself, well, that's a fundamental design flaw.
Right. The pressure hull is everything.
It is. So why would an issue with the cooling system require potentially a fundamental redesign and extensive disassembly, as some reports suggest?
Yeah, why?
Because the cooling system isn't just pipes, it's intimately connected to the integrity of the pressure hull. Any misalignment, any flaw in the specialized welds holding all that complex piping for propulsion and cooling means two potentially disastrous things.
Okay.
One, a risk of hull penetration at depth. That's the ultimate nightmare scenario for a subcrew. And two, noise. Stealth is a submarine's only real defense. A misaligned or vibrating cooling system acts like a giant loudspeaker underwater.
So it completely negates the whole point of having a stealth submarine.
It eliminates that asymmetric advantage the Haikun is designed to provide. Analysts suggest if this kind of fundamental alignment issue is confirmed, it demands a massive effort. Disassembling engine compartments, re-engineering the mounting, basically pushing the entire project back significantly, months, maybe longer.
So it sounds like they are really fighting for basic survivability and stealth right now. The sources specifically highlight that two critical systems remain unadjusted because of these integration issues: the main engine and power management system, and the system you mentioned earlier, the Integrated Comprehensive Management System, or IPMS.
Yes, the IPMS. Think of it as the digital brain, or maybe the central nervous system of the submarine. It manages everything: ballast tanks, rudder control, fire suppression, propulsion. It's the operating system for the entire platform.
So if the IPMS is malfunctioning or unadjusted?
It means the whole vessel is essentially unstable, or at least not fully controllable or integrated. And this is where the geopolitics comes crashing right down to the circuit board level. It's fascinating, in a grim way.
Okay, let's focus on that synchronization challenge. U.S. defense giant Lockheed Martin was apparently tasked with synchronizing the combat system. So the torpedo tubes, the sonar, with the ship's operating system, the IPMS. But the underlying systems came from different continents.
Precisely. And they encountered severe synchronization issues. Why? Because every supplier uses disparate standards, different interfaces, unique software architectures. Imagine trying to run, say, a European operating system that expects data formatted in a very specific way, but the American sonar array is sending data packets formatted completely differently.
It's like trying to plug a European appliance into a U.S. socket, but on a software level, times 1,000.
It's a language barrier at the deepest level of code. The engineers were dealing with incompatible operating logic, proprietary interfaces they couldn't easily access, and restrictive licensing agreements that make synchronization nearly impossible without basically rebuilding the entire software architecture from scratch. Or getting everyone to agree, which
brings us to that incredible anecdote you mentioned about diplomacy at the circuit board level. It sounds like the perfect illustration of how this external political pressure translates into absurd, almost Kafkaesque delays.
Absolutely. Picture this. An engineer is trying desperately to get the UK-sourced IPMS, which, remember, operates the rudder and monitors the hull, to successfully interface with a specific, highly sensitive American military-grade sonar array. They try everything. Weeks of troubleshooting, checking the code, the wiring. Nothing works. The systems just will not sync.
So what was the problem? A bug? Faulty hardware?
The engineer eventually discovered the problem wasn't a technical error at all. It was legal.
Legal? How?
The core issue was not a wiring schematic, but a piece of paper. Specifically, the licensing agreement for the European-originating IPMS.
You're kidding.
Not at all. That agreement explicitly prohibited it from directly interfacing with that specific U.S. military-grade hardware without an explicit diplomatic waiver.
Why on earth would they put that in?
Well, it was likely put in place by the European supplier to protect their own proprietary information, maybe prevent unauthorized technology transfer, or, frankly, just to avoid diplomatic blowback from Beijing if word got out they were enabling this level of integration. Plausible deniability, perhaps.
So the engineer's work, this multi-billion-dollar project, the operational readiness of the entire submarine, it all grinds to a halt. Not waiting for a critical part to arrive by ship, but waiting for, as you said, a piece of paper caught between 3 different foreign ministries.
That is the absolute definition of bureaucracy gone mad, driven entirely by external political pressure and the complexities of sourcing under isolation.
It really shows that Taiwan's challenge isn't just procuring components, it's the near impossible task of making components from reluctant, disparate, politically cautious allies actually cooperate seamlessly.
Exactly. The technical failure here is, in many ways, just a symptom of a much deeper geopolitical integration failure. It's the inescapable cost of Taiwan's unique situation.
But these incredibly complex technical hurdles, they aren't happening in a vacuum, are they? They are being managed, or perhaps mismanaged, by people.
Yeah.
How are these breakdowns translating into organizational friction and domestic political chaos back in Taiwan?
Well, they seem to be translating into a failure of coordination that apparently starts right at the top. The delays look like they reflect a fundamental breakdown in cohesive project management and maybe even leadership vision. We can see this breakdown quite vividly when we look at the human element, the people on the ground at the CSBC shipyard in Calcium.
Right, the shipyard. Tell us more about that environment. What's the mood among the people actually building this thing? Is it still national pride, or is frustration setting in?
I think it's both. There is immense national pride, certainly, but also, yes, immense frustration. There's an anecdote about a veteran welder nicknamed Lao Wang that really speaks volumes.
Lao Wang.
Okay. Yeah. He's described as a highly skilled worker, fiercely dedicated to building Taiwan's first indigenous submarine. He finished his specific hull section integration, which is a highly technical and critical step, actually, ahead of schedule.
Okay, so far so good. Ahead of schedule is great.
It should be, but now he apparently just sits idle, waiting.
Why? Why is a successful ahead of schedule worker now just waiting around?
Because a crucial electronic rack subsystem, basically a piece of internal architecture that needs to be installed inside the whole section he just finished welding, is held up. It's either delayed in procurement somewhere, or maybe it failed an inspection, or perhaps it's stuck because of the IPMS sonar integration chaos we were just talking about. His success is completely nullified by another department's failure or delay.
And his sentiment reportedly was, the hands are willing, but the head is confused. That perfectly captures the feeling, doesn't it? Critical project management and communication failures plaguing the whole Indigenous Defense Submarine, or IDS, program.
It really does. It highlights a disjointed process. One team hits its targets, but it doesn't matter because another team lacks basic supply chain management, or technical integration support, or maybe just clear leadership direction. This kind of chaos seems to be why former advisor Guo Xi issued such a severe public critique recently.
What did he say?
He apparently accused the current Navy chief of having almost zero substantive knowledge of submarine technology and, importantly, project management for something this complex. Guo Xi publicly warned that these integration issues could persist for another year, maybe even until September of next year, without a drastic change in leadership direction and critically technical expertise at the command level.
Wow, that's a blistering critique from a former insider. And this leadership vacuum, or at least the perception of one, has had immediate political consequences, right? Leading to a major financial freeze by the opposition parties.
That's right. The opposition parties, specifically the Kuomintang, the KMT, and the Taiwan People's Party, the TPP, have taken pretty decisive action. For listeners outside Taiwan, these are the major opposition parties, generally advocating for, let's say, closer ties or at least a less confrontational approach towards Beijing.
And what did they do?
They voted to freeze NT $1.8 billion, which is about US $56 million, in follow-on funding. This money was intended for the next 7 submarines in the planned fleet of 8.
So they've put the brakes on the rest of the program.
Essentially, yes. The money will only be released once this prototype, the Haikun, successfully completes all its sea trials. Proponents naturally call this necessary accountability for missed deadlines and technical problems. Critics, just as naturally, call it political sabotage of a critical defense program.
Okay, but regardless of the political label, accountability or sabotage, what are the immediate real-world consequences of freezing funding for a long-term defense production run like this? It can't be simple.
No, the risk is enormous and potentially structural. Building modern submarines requires a highly specialized industrial base. You need specialized welding rigs, massive assembly halls, bespoke digital design tools, and crucially, a highly trained, specialized workforce like Lao Wang.
People you can't just find anywhere.
Exactly. These facilities and this expertise are incredibly expensive to maintain, especially during pauses or periods of uncertainty. A funding freeze like this jeopardizes the entire concept of a continuous multi-phase production run. If the funding becomes unstable or stop-start,
then those specialized engineers and welders might look for work elsewhere.
Precisely. They'll seek more stable employment. The supply chain partners, who invested heavily based on the promise of building 8 ships, will lose confidence and might reallocate their resources.
So the opposition's move doesn't just cut a budget line for this year. It risks the long-term viability of creating that self-sufficient submarine industrial base Taiwan wants so badly. If they lose that specialized workforce or the unique tooling infrastructure, restarting the program later would be immensely difficult and far more expensive.
It pushes the whole IDS program into a really precarious, non-continuous state. You simply cannot turn a highly specialized defense industry on and off like a tap without incurring massive financial penalties and, more importantly, losing irreplaceable expertise.
Okay, but let's challenge the narrative a bit. Is this failure, this chaos, really unique to Taiwan? Or is it just, the incredibly high price of entry for trying to climb the Everest of defense industries, especially under such difficult circumstances?
That is the essential contextual question, isn't it? And the consensus among many defense analysts is that actually delays and cost overruns are entirely normal, almost expected, for complex indigenous defense projects, especially when attempting something as incredibly complicated as a modern submarine for the first time. Taiwan might be being judged against an almost impossible standard here.
Can you give us some comparison points? What happened when other, maybe more established naval powers tried to do something similar?
Sure. Look at Spain. Spain has far more mature shipbuilding experience than Taiwan, right? It still took them roughly 20 years to deliver their first domestically designed S-80 class submarine, and they faced huge technical hurdles along the way.
20 years. Oh.
Or look at South Korea, a global shipbuilding powerhouse. They still took about 7 years from concept to delivery for their first major domestic submarine, the KSS-3, and they had decades of relevant industrial infrastructure already in place. Taiwan, when it launched the IDS program, was starting from virtually zero prior experience in building modern stealth submarines.
Right. That context does put the current setbacks, which arguably seem to be maybe a year or so behind the initial optimistic schedule and maybe a 10% budget overrun so far, into a very different light. They really are attempting a moonshot, but doing it under intense diplomatic and technical isolation.
Exactly. And the argument being made internally and by supporters of the program is that rushing the process just to meet some artificial political deadline, like the November one that's now clearly slipping, would be the real catastrophe.
Because of the safety risks.
Absolutely. That specific warning we heard at the start, that forcing the boat to dive before all systems are properly adjusted and verified could cost lives, really underlines the imperative here. Quality and safety must trump political expediency, especially when you're dealing with the immense pressures on a pressure hull miles underwater and the lives of the crew inside. Rushing is not an option.
Okay, this takes us directly to the core strategic debate then. Given the immense technical difficulty, the cost, the delays, is the submarine even the correct platform for Taiwan's defense strategy? Is the Haikun and the planned fleet of 8 an essential part of the asymmetric defense strategy? Or is it, as some critics are now loudly claiming, simply a very expensive prestige trap?
Well, proponents argue its necessity very aggressively. Submarines, just by their nature, their inherent stealth, offer higher survivability than pretty much any surface vessel or aircraft in the opening stages of a potential conflict.
Especially against China's missile capabilities.
Exactly. In the face of overwhelming PLA missile capabilities, the submarine is potentially the only large, potent platform that might be guaranteed, or at least highly likely, to survive the first wave of attacks.
So what specific tactical role would these 8 submarines, assuming they eventually get built and working, be expected to play? What's the job description?
Their role is basically threefold, as strategists see it. First, simply to survive that initial onslaught. Second, to try and break or at least complicate a Chinese naval blockade by targeting high-value surface vessels. And third, to impose significant losses on the PLA's surface fleets, particularly if they try to operate in key strategic waterways or the littoral areas around Taiwan. Former Taiwan Navy Admiral Huang Shuquang really emphasized their importance in controlling access to maritime choke points.
Which choke points are we talking about primarily?
Primarily the Miyako Strait, which lies between Okinawa and Miyako Island. It's a key exit point for Chinese naval forces heading out from the East China Sea into the wider Pacific. And also the Bashi Channel, south of Taiwan, which is critical for their access between the South China Sea and the Philippine Sea.
So the idea is that Taiwan submarines, armed with something like the US-made Mk-48 heavy torpedoes, could patrol these areas and make it very risky for China to completely surround the island or cut off potential external supply routes during a conflict.
That's the plan. And the key element here is what analysts call the uncertainty factor.
Uncertainty. How does a relatively small fleet of, say, 8 subs exert such an outsized deterrent effect? It's not about matching ship for ship, is it?
No, not at all. It's the sheer stealth. Even a small number of truly stealthy modern submarines forces the PLA Navy to divert extensive anti-submarine warfare ASW resources across vast areas of ocean just on the chance a sub might be there.
Right. Hunting for a quiet sub is hard.
Incredibly hard. An ASW campaign is slow, it's resource-intensive, it requires specialized aircraft, helicopters, surface ships with towed arrays, maybe even other submarines. Even if Taiwan submarines aren't physically present in a specific area at a specific time, the mere possibility that they could be forces the PLA to complicate and slow down every single aspect of their invasion or blockade planning. This psychological deterrence delivers a disproportionate, or as you said, asymmetric effect.
Okay, that's the argument for asymmetry. Makes sense. But, isn't impressing military analysts maybe less important than meeting an operational timeline when the perceived threat feels immediate? What's the risk of not rushing it beyond the safety aspect? This brings us back to that prestige trap critique.
Right. The prestige trap argument basically holds that this hugely expensive and complex submarine project consumes scarce, high-value resources, we're talking billions of dollars, specialized labor, irreplaceable diplomatic capital, that maybe would be better directed at fundamentally different kinds of systems.
Like what? What's the alternative they propose?
Generally, things that are inexpensive, numerous, and highly survivable. Think swarms of drones, mobile coastal defense missiles, sea mines, things like that. The critics argue that 8 submarines, however capable, cannot ultimately stop a full-scale invasion or a determined, sustained blockade by the sheer weight of the PLA Navy.
And they often point to the war in Ukraine as their primary example, right? As a model for modern, successful asymmetric defense.
Yes, and it's become a really powerful critique in these debates. Ukraine's defense, particularly its successes against a larger conventional force, relies heavily on inexpensive distributed assets. You see small drones spotting targets for artillery, the HIMARS multiple launch rocket system hitting command posts and logistics hubs deep behind the lines, and extensive use of defensive trenches and dispersed infantry tactics.
So the argument is, why spend billions on one complex, potentially vulnerable platform like a submarine when those same funds could buy literally thousands of attack drones and maybe hundreds of decentralized mobile long-range missiles?
Exactly. The war in Ukraine suggests to these critics that modern conflict, especially for a defender facing a larger aggressor, might be decided by attrition using large numbers of survivable, sometimes even disposable systems, rather than relying on a few high-value, high-profile targets that the enemy will focus all their efforts on destroying first.
It sounds like Taiwan's military leadership is caught in a really tough bind then. They seem to be facing 2 distinct, almost contradictory requirements. The need for assets that can survive a full-blown wartime invasion scenario, like submarines, and the simultaneous need for assets to deter or respond to China's peacetime coercion, the gray zone stuff.
That tension creates what some analysts have called the paradox of visibility. It's a deep strategic anxiety for Taipei.
Explain that paradox.
Well, submarines, for all their potential wartime value, are strategically almost irrelevant against China's intensifying gray zone operations. The gray zone includes those daily intrusions by PLA aircraft into Taiwan's air defense identification zone or ships maneuvering near Taiwanese waters. These tactics are designed to wear down Taiwan's forces and its political will without actually crossing the threshold of open conflict.
And those tactics rely on being seen, right?
Yeah.
Visible coercion.
Precisely. They rely on visible coercion. A submerged submarine, no matter how stealthy or deadly it might be in a war, has effectively no signaling value to deter these day-to-day peacetime incursions. You can't really shadow an intruding aircraft with a submarine.
So to respond to those visible gray zone intrusions, Taiwan must rely on its own high-profile visible assets, things like fighter jets scrambling, Coast Guard cutters, Navy frigates showing the flag, the very things the public sees and is perhaps reassured by.
Exactly. But here's the paradox. The assets needed for that visible peacetime coercion response, the jets, the surface ships, are precisely the assets that are the most vulnerable to China's advanced missile arsenal and sophisticated satellite reconnaissance capabilities in the opening hours of a high-intensity conflict. They'd be the first targets.
While the submarines, which are arguably necessary for long-term survival and deterrence in that wartime scenario, are invisible and largely useless in peacetime, are slow and expensive to field, and don't help respond to the immediate, visible, daily threat of the gray zone tactics.
That's the bind. Taiwan has to constantly decide if its limited defense budget is going toward assets that look good in a parade and respond to today's gray zone pressure, or towards the assets that might actually survive the first hour of a war tomorrow. It's a terrible choice.
And when we talk about these delays with the Haikun, we often quantify them in billions of dollars or in months slipped on a schedule. But we shouldn't overlook the direct human cost of this project chaos, should we? The ongoing setbacks must be eroding the readiness and morale of the highly trained personnel who are supposed to crew these new cutting-edge vessels.
Yes, that's the critical compounding impact of the delay that often gets missed in the technical or political discussions. Consider the situation of someone we can call Lieutenant Huang. He's reportedly part of the very first cohort of sailors trained specifically for the advanced, quiet, high-tech systems of the new Haikun class. He's spent years studying its specialized protocols, its unique operating procedures.
So he's ready to go. Highly specialized training.
Exactly, but because of the sea trial delays and the uncertainty around delivery, he is now temporarily reassigned, where? To the Hai Lim class. These are submarines Taiwan acquired from the Netherlands back in the 1980s.
The 1980s. So he's now training on, 40-year-old technology for a potential 21st century fight? That has got to be a massive morale sink.
It absolutely is. The delay doesn't just mean a ship isn't delivered on time. It means the highly perishable, specialized skill set required for operating the Haikun is degrading. People forget skills they don't practice, and the morale of the future fleet's core personnel is undoubtedly suffering. The window for defense preparation feels like it's shrinking, and this delay is actively undermining the readiness of the very people needed to operate the new systems once they finally arrive, whenever that might be.
It's important to note, though, that while the Haikun is struggling, these delays aren't stopping Taiwan from pursuing other concurrent defense initiatives, right? Especially ones that seem to better align with that core philosophy of the porcupine strategy, things focused on survivability, dispersal, and attrition. Taiwan does seem to be actively shifting towards unmanned systems in other areas.
Yes, this is where you see the strategic focus perhaps being applied more effectively, or at least yielding quicker results. Recent defense expositions in Taiwan show a clear pivot towards indigenous development and also joint production with U.S. firms, particularly focused on unmanned and low-cost, high-volume assets. The National Chung-Shan Institute of Science and Technology, NCS, which is Taiwan's primary defense R&D agency, is really leading this charge.
Can you give us some specific examples of these new platforms that seem to be progressing better?
Sure. We've seen the recent debut of the domestically produced Barracuda 500 cruise missile. It's designed potentially for swarm attacks, relatively small, autonomous, likely low cost, and difficult for air defenses to counter when launched in large numbers. This seems to align with reported cooperation with U.S. defense companies like Anduril, which specializes in AI and autonomy.
Okay, what else? Especially underwater.
Well, they reportedly reached agreements for joint production of the Divel-D Large Displacement Uncrewed Undersea Vehicle, or UUV, and also the Copperhead Autonomous Torpedo. These are exactly the kind of cheaper, potentially disposable, survivable naval systems that can dramatically multiply Taiwan's presence and threat beneath the waves without risking large, expensive crewed vessels like the Haikun.
And what about in the air? Are they doing similar things with drones?
Yes. They continue to develop their own Qinfeng series of unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, and there's also reported cooperation with the U.S. partner Kratos on systems potentially derived from their target drones, possibly configured as loitering munitions or suicide drones. Again, these are exactly the kind of inexpensive, lightweight attrition capability that proved surprisingly decisive, especially in the early stages of the Ukraine conflict.
So that shift towards unmanned and distributed systems seems strategically sound, reflecting lessons learned elsewhere. But it must be viewed against the rising counter threat from China, right? Particularly PRC anti-submarine warfare capabilities.
Yeah.
China isn't just passively waiting for Taiwan to finish its prestige projects or develop its drone swarms. They must be actively working to counter them.
Oh, absolutely. China is rapidly improving its ASW capabilities, trying to erode that traditional advantage of stealth that submarines rely on.
How sophisticated are China's anti-submarine capabilities becoming? What are we seeing?
They're expanding rapidly across all domains. This includes the reported deployment of sophisticated fixed sonar networks along the first island chain, think underwater microphones, listening, constantly utilizing passive detection systems to build a continuous real-time picture of the underwater environment.
Okay, fixed sensors. What else?
They are also investing heavily in advanced maritime patrol aircraft designed specifically for ASW, like their Y-8Q aircraft, which use things like magnetic anomaly detectors, MAD booms, to spot submerged metal hulls and dipping sonar and sonobus. And critically, they are also deploying their own underwater drones, UUVs, designed specifically for persistent surveillance and potentially hunting enemy submarines.
So even if the Haikun eventually works perfectly, is perfectly quiet and fully operational, it's going to be operating in an underwater environment that is rapidly becoming much more transparent, much more dangerous for submarines than it was even a decade ago.
That's the stark reality. The great traditional advantage of the submarine, its stealth, is becoming increasingly temporary and challenged. And if a full-scale blockade or conflict were to occur, you can be sure the Chinese military would throw overwhelming continuous ASW resources at the problem.
So what does that mean for the submarine's role?
It means that while Taiwan submarines might indeed survive longer than its surface ships in a conflict, without external resupply or significant intervention from allies, their endurance under constant ASW pressure is ultimately finite. They face what one defense official reportedly called death by suffocation. They run out of battery power, air, food, or torpedoes eventually. They might buy valuable time, perhaps for external intervention, but they probably cannot win a battle of attrition against a determined, large-scale blockade all by themselves.
Okay, to fully grasp the kind of diplomatic isolation pressure that seems to have created this United Nations of Systems problem for the Haikun, we really need to place this whole crisis in the broader geopolitical context, especially regarding U.S. support for Taiwan. Because we seem to be seeing a somewhat conflicting message coming out of Washington lately, don't we? Reflecting a tension between, say, what Congress wants and perhaps what the executive branch prefers policy-wise.
That tension is definitely palpable right now. On one hand, you have congressional actions that strongly reaffirm a very robust bipartisan commitment to Taiwan's defense and security. For instance, the U.S. House Foreign Affairs Committee recently advanced the Taiwan Allies Fund Act. Now, this act isn't directly about weapons, it's more about shoring up Taipei's diplomatic standing.
How does it do that?
It aims to provide funds to help subsidize nations, especially smaller ones in the Pacific or Latin America, to resist Beijing's relentless campaign of diplomatic pressure trying to get them to switch recognition from Taipei to Beijing. It's about counteracting that isolation campaign.
Okay, and they also advanced the Six Assurances of Taiwan Act. What exactly does that do? Why is that significant?
Well, the Six Assurances are these long-standing, though previously informal, U.S. policy guidelines regarding Taiwan that date all the way back to the Reagan administration in the 1980s. This act seeks to codify them into actual U.S. law.
And what do they assure Taiwan?
They explicitly state things like, the U.S. will not set a date for ending arms sales to Taiwan. It won't pressure Taiwan to negotiate with Beijing. It won't consult with China before making arms sales decisions to Taiwan. And it reaffirms the fundamental defense component of the relationship under the Taiwan Relations Act. Making these laws sends a very clear legislative message of unwavering commitment from Congress.
Okay, so that's clear, consistent, strong legislative support. But then, as you said, the executive branch seems to have sent a slightly different signal recently, particularly with its policy preference for military sales over direct military aid.
Exactly. There was that reported, though apparently ultimately unfinalized, decision by the U.S. president at some point not to approve a specific $400 million military aid package to Taiwan, using presidential drawdown authority. This decision seems to reflect a consistent administration preference over the last couple of years to prioritize foreign military sales, where Taiwan pays for the equipment over providing outright grant aid.
Why does that distinction between sales and aid actually matter? And maybe more importantly, how does Beijing likely interpret this preference for sales over aid?
Well, symbolically, it matters because grant aid often implies a stronger sense of partnership, shared commitment, and maybe urgency, while sales are fundamentally a transaction, albeit between friendly nations. While arms sales to Taiwan are expected to remain very robust, Beijing likely perceives the reluctance to provide direct military aid as a perhaps small but tangible success for their policy of pressure and coercion. Beijing seeks to limit any form of international collaboration or support that might solidify Taipei's standing as something akin to a sovereign entity deserving of foreign aid, like Ukraine gets, for example. They probably interpret any perceived hesitancy by Washington to deepen engagement, even the refusal of a relatively small aid package compared to the sales volume, as a limited concession. They might see it as evidence their pressure tactics are working, at least at the margins, which could potentially embolden them to demand further limitations or concessions in future high-stakes diplomatic interactions.
Interesting. Okay, stepping back now to the wider regional level, this Haikun crisis isn't happening in isolation, is it? It's playing out amidst what feels like an accelerating arms race
Yeah.
and a lot of coalition building across the entire Indo-Pacific. We're seeing a pretty clear response from many U.S.-aligned nations to what they perceive as heightened PRC aggression, particularly in the South China Sea.
Absolutely. We are definitely seeing a concerted focus on strengthening regional coalitions, particularly involving the Philippines, which is really on the front line of PRC maritime pressure tactics right now. The UK, Japan, Canada, even France are all significantly increasing their military cooperation and engagement with Manila.
And how are they doing that, practically speaking?
A key mechanism is by negotiating or finalizing these important legal frameworks known as Status of Visiting Forces Agreements, or SOVFAs, with the Philippines.
SOVFAs, why are they such a key indicator of this coalition building effort? What do they actually allow?
Well, a SOVFA is basically a foundational legal treaty. It establishes the rights and responsibilities of foreign military personnel when they're operating in a host country. It governs really practical things like legal jurisdiction if there's an incident, customs procedures for bringing in equipment, tax exemptions, things like that. Crucially, finalizing these agreements signals a clear political intention to increase military presence, facilitate more frequent joint training exercises, rotational basing of forces, and port calls in the region. It's all about building interoperability and demonstrating collective resolve, directly countering PRC attempts to dominate waterways like the South China Sea.
Okay, so on one hand, we see allies trying to double down on regional resilience and collective defense. But on the other hand, Beijing isn't standing still either. We see them trying to deepen their own influence, sometimes even with traditional U.S. allies, right?
Yes, and the perfect example of Beijing's counter-diplomacy in action right now is Thailand, which, remember, is officially a U.S. major non-NATO ally. Thailand recently finalized the purchase of a PRC-made S-2060 diesel-electric submarine.
A Chinese submarine for a U.S. ally. And what's the critical detail about this particular submarine deal that makes it relevant here?
It's the engine saga. Thailand originally wanted the submarine equipped with German-made MTU diesel engines, which are highly regarded. But Germany blocked the export. Why? Under the long-standing 1989 European Union arms embargo that was imposed on China after the Tiananmen Square incident.
Ah, so the EU embargo prevented the German engines from being put into a Chinese hull, even though it was destined for Thailand.
Exactly. So after much delay and negotiation, the submarine will now be equipped with Chinese-made diesel engines instead. This deal, which was finalized alongside things like combined Air Force exercises between Thailand and China called Falcon Strike, really shows how the PRC is using military diplomacy and arms sales quite effectively to deepen its influence and relationships, even in key Southeast Asian capitals that are also allied with the U.S.
Which, in turn, further squeezes the diplomatic and defense industrial space that Taiwan has available to operate in. The very difficulty Taiwan faces in buying diverse components is directly related to Beijing's relative success in selling its own integrated state-controlled military platforms to Taiwan's neighbors.
It absolutely confirms that every single aspect of Taiwan's defense procurement, especially for major platforms like submarines, is a pitched diplomatic battle. It's fought not only in Taipei and Washington, but in capitals right across the region and indeed around the world. The Haikun's technical problems started long before the first piece of steel was cut. They started in foreign ministries.
So wrapping this up, the Haikun saga is clearly far more than just a technical footnote in the history of naval shipbuilding, isn't it? It feels more like a defining case study in simultaneous failure, or at least immense struggle across technical integration, political management, and maybe even core strategic priorities.
I think that's fair. We have certainly seen the crippling cost of Taiwan's intense diplomatic isolation, which forces this reliance on heterogeneous systems, that United Nations of systems, leading inevitably to integration headaches that are as much bureaucratic and diplomatic puzzles as they are purely technical flaws.
And then this technical chaos seems to be worsened by domestic political friction, leading to things like funding instability that risks the long-term specialized industrial capacity Taiwan needs to build the rest of the fleet.
Exactly. And all of this is playing out against that crucial backdrop of rising PRC counterthreats, specifically the rapidly expanding anti-submarine warfare capabilities China is fielding, which are actively working to erode the core strategic advantage of stealth these submarines were supposed to provide. The stark reality is that this new fleet, whenever it's finally delivered and operational, will be entering a far more transparent and potentially hostile underwater environment than its designers might have initially anticipated just a decade ago.
Which leaves us with that existential tension you mentioned, haunting Taipei, and perhaps many of its allies as well. Is Taiwan's current defense budget truly serving operational necessity? Is it primarily investing in the distributed, numerous, survivable systems like drones and missiles that seem required for a modern attritional war?
Or is it still, at least partly, satisfying the symbolic political need for these high-profile, high-prestige platforms like submarines and fighter jets, platforms that definitely reassure the public and look good in peacetime parades, but which could potentially be the first, most vulnerable targets to fall in a real conflict with a peer competitor like China?
That distinction between the visible comfort of prestige platforms and the often invisible necessity of distributed, survivable defense systems, that seems to be the core strategic challenge Taiwan has to somehow reconcile if it's going to secure its future in an increasingly dangerous neighborhood.